Hey everybody, this is Jason. I'm your host of World History for You. I'm bringing my 2 decades of teaching world history to you to make the subject comprehensible, right? Because I know that this can seem like a very daunting topic, right? We're talking about, for this course at least 1,000 years of world history, right? Close to it, right? We're going from 1200 to the present. So how in the world do we cover something that covers so much time and encompasses the entire planet? Right? That sounds almost impossible, right? How do you memorize all of that history? Well, we don't, right? That's the thing. We don't want to try to memorize it. That's not the goal here. First of all, it's impossible. You just can't do it. Secondly, what purpose does it serve, right? It's not really helping you. It's not really helping anybody, right? So what do we want to do instead, right? We want to be able to tell the story of world history. That's really the goal here, right? So like I said, I've taught this class for nearly 2 decades. I've seen the problems that students have had over time, and I've got some solutions to make this comprehensible, right? To make it work for you, to make you be able to understand this very broad and very broad topic that covers a very long timeline, right? So first thing we want to talk about is taking that long timeline and breaking it into pieces, right? So we call this periodization. And the way that'll work for us is we're going to have a few different time periods, right? So the first one is 1200 to 1450, right? That's the time before Europeans venture out into the rest of the world, right? Then we go from 1450 to 1750, from 1750 to 1900, and then from 1900 to the present. Okay? So we've got these distinct time periods that we can work with. Okay? So once we've done that, once we've established how to break this timeline into pieces, the next thing we want to do is take those time periods and analyze them, right? And the best way to do this, the way that most world historians do it, is through world systems analysis. Okay? There's a number of ways you can do this. Okay? But we're going to try to keep it quite simple for you. Okay? Under world systems analysis, what we want to do here is take that particular time period and look at the Earth, the planet, as a whole system, right? How are these different regions of the world interacting with each other, right? That's what we really want to look at, right? How is China interacting with India? How is India interacting with East Africa, etc.? Okay? And when we do this, what we're going to notice are a few things. One, you end up with what we'll call core regions and periphery regions, right? Core regions being the parts of the world that are generating surplus wealth, right? These are the wealthier parts of the world. Peripheries, oftentimes this is where your raw materials are coming out of. This is where labor may come out of, okay? So what's the connection between the cores and the peripheries, right? How are they working together? Is the periphery being exploited? Right? These are questions we want to be able to ask. Right? So again, we'll look at each of these time periods and see how they function as a whole system. Right? We're trying to look at these things holistically. Right? Now, once we're able to do that, we can go from time period to time period and look at changes and continuities from time period to time period. Right? Why are things changing? Why are they staying the same? What are the consequences of these changes and continuities? Right? And that's really the focus of the class, is looking at how we get from 1200, where we have this completely different system, to today, right? Where we have this Western capitalist style system, which is what a guy named Emanuel Wallerstein was looking at, right? So if you want to get into world systems analysis, he's the guy that kind of spearheaded this in the 1970s, okay? So Wallerstein is looking at whole world as a system, and what he wants to figure out is, how did we get to a Western capitalist world system? Okay, and his starting point there is kind of late 1400s, right? He says, all right, 1492, you have a interconnected world now, right? Both hemispheres of the world are connected. He says that's when you get a true world system, and we can start looking at the development of, what we call Western capitalism out of that system. Okay? However, there are other scholars and historians who can push that timeline back a little bit further, right? Because if you take the world before 1492, you got an Eastern hemisphere and you've got a Western hemisphere. And other scholars and historians have said we can take those as individual units, right? The Eastern Hemisphere is its own world system. Western Hemisphere is its own world system. So, for example, Janet Abu Lughod, and before European hegemony, she's looking at 1250 to 1350. That's the world system prior to the Europeans entering it. Okay? Very influential book, right? She's pushing this back and saying, before the Europeans show up, you have a very vibrant world system, right? There's a lot of stuff happening in the global south, right? She looks at China, she looks at the Islamic world, she looks at East Africa, and looks at how these different regions of the world interact with each other, right? And what she'll point out in here is Europe is on the periphery, right? They want access to what's happening in the rest of the world, right? They want those global goods. They want those luxury goods that are being moved around the Indian Ocean trade networks, that are being moved across these overland trade networks, right? And you got to remember, that's what the 1400s for Europe is all about. How do we get to those global goods, right? That's the point, right? Other historians, other scholars, like Andre Frank, push it back even further, okay? In his book Reorient, he looks at, he's going to push it back 2,000 years, right, into what we call the BC era, okay? Where he's saying you had the makings of world systems then, right? The Romans are buying Chinese silk, right? They're connected through trade, right? And it's interesting, that causes problems for Rome, right? You have other scholars who push it back even further. But like I said, we're going to keep this simple. We are going to agree with Abu Lughod and say, yeah, you can push this back to earlier periods. Right? Now, with this idea, like I said, Wallerstein is looking for how did we get to where we're at today, right? And what he's really looking at is this idea of the Great Divergence in history, right? How does the West become dominant economically and politically, right? And why do you have this decline in other places in the world, especially Asia, right? What happened there, right? What caused that shift in the global balance of power and the global economy, right? In the next video, we're going to get into that some more, because that's where you can get into some really interesting discussions about what we call the rise of the West. That can be very problematic. So the next video, we'll get into that in depth, right? What is this idea of the rise of the West? Why is it wrong, right? And how can we get past that way of thinking, right? How can we create a truer history that is not built on, basically cope from Western historians, right? We want to create a narrative that gets away from this idea that the West inevitably is going to rise, right? Because it's just not true, right? So next video, we'll get into that, right? So overall, again, the goal here is to be able to create a narrative that you can understand, right? You can tell yourself the story from 1200 to the present. How do we get from there to here, right? And how do you do that? We take these smaller chunks of time. We look at how the world system functions within that, couple 100-year period. And then we look at the next period, right? How did we get from here to here? What are the changes? What are the continuities? And what are the consequences of those changes and continuities, right? So I'm glad you joined us. Please subscribe. Please share our videos, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Hey you. Thanks for watching World History for You. Please subscribe and share with your friends. We'll see you next time.